Good morning. Welcome to the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory, and welcome to the 2026 Science on Saturday lecture series. My name is Andrew Zwicker, and I am the host. I have the amazing privilege of being the host. This is my 12th year of hosting. My official title is I'm the head of public engagement and workforce development, which means I get to do lots of different things, but it includes hosting Science on Saturday. This is also the laboratory's 75th, as you can see, 75th anniversary. For 75 years, we have been powering the possibility of fusion energy. And those of you I know are thinking, yeah, okay, and how many more years, right? But you can see that there is tremendous activity happening both here as we build a new laboratory building, which will include office space, the Princeton Plasma Innovation Center, as we get ready later this year to turn on the National Spherical Torus Experiment upgrade. That'll happen later this fall. And for those of you who follow fusion know that there is now billions of dollars going into the private sector to try to accelerate fusion. Artificial intelligence is accelerating fusion. It's a very, very exciting time. And I hope that you will see sometime in the next year or so an announcement that a private fusion company wants to set up shop here in New Jersey and continue the quest for unlimited clean fusion energy. It is also, we've kind of lost track. We think it's our 44th year in a row. It could be 43 or could be 45 of Science on Saturday, right? Which means for more than 4 decades in this space, minus so COVID interruption, we have been presenting some of the best science lectures to the general public you can find anywhere in the state, anywhere in the country. And it's because we are so fortunate to live in a community where people are scientifically curious, right? Regardless of what's going on out there in the world, you're here because you are just curious about what's going on in science, whether it's about pollination and bees today, or how our brain works, or what's going on with lasers. I'm so beyond thrilled for the lineup that we have today. So on the first lecture, I always like to do this. So if you're listening online, I'm going to ask now how many years people have been coming to Science on Saturday. Feel free to put in the chat if you're on Zoom. But show of hands, who's here for the first time ever? Oh, I love it. I love it. Okay. Who's been coming for, let's say, between 1 and 5 years, as best you can tell? That's a lot of hands. All right. How about you think you've been coming probably close to 10 years? That's a lot of hands. I'll keep on going. 15 years? Our speaker's got her hand up. Love it. 20? 20 years. Hands are going up. My goodness. All right, all right, all right. 25 years. Yep. There's 1, 2, 3. I love it. Okay. 30 years? Keep on going. 35 years. Maybe, maybe. We don't know. We can't prove it. 35 years. Anybody been coming since 40 years? Yes. 4 or 5 years ago, we had a speaker from the University of Minnesota. Normally, we take speakers from New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York, just because it's easy on travel. But we invited someone from the University of Minnesota, a professor there, because she had been coming when she was a little girl, and now I wanted to invite her back to come and give a speech. So we're on to multiple generations. So it is just thrilling. Let me do a couple of housekeeping things, and then we're ready to go. First of all, Oops, not that one. Uh, there we go. This one. First of all, I always like to remind people, so this is my 12th year, but for many, many years before that, a wonderful electrical engineer by the name of Ronnie Hatcher was the host. And he's the one who really put Science on Saturday into a every year go, 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 go. He tragically lost his life about a dozen years ago, and I stepped in his place. But we've named the lecture series after him. He was really just a beloved engineer here for the decades that he was here. Um, as I always say, I know you're not really here for the science. You're just here for the bagels, the donuts, the coffee. We keep on ordering more and more and more. Uh, Couple of things, right? If the fire alarm were to go off, obviously there are exits in the back here. This is also an exit to the outside. There are steps if you go out that door that would then take you out a different entrance. If the fire alarm were to go off, our site protection folks are here and would guide everybody. As always, they ask you to hold questions till the end, and we'll pass microphones around. I'll be monitoring for the folks on Zoom. I'll be monitoring questions in the chat. We're recording the talks and we put them online about a week later so you can tell your friends about it. Okay. And with that, it is my utter delight to introduce you to our first speaker, who is Professor Rachael Winfree from Rutgers University. You can see her short bio here, but a graduate of Princeton University and Dartmouth University, Dartmouth College. She has studied approximately 600 species of bees. I visited her lab last year. And the moment I went into the lab, I knew I wanted to ask her to be a Science on Saturday speaker. I've never seen more bees in my entire life. Drawer after drawer of bees. And she's like, oh, this one is that, and this one is this. And I'm just like, holy cow, come tell everyone about it. She is a leading expert when it comes to bees and pollinators. And would you please give a warm welcome to Professor Rachael Winfree? So I prepped her. For those of you who are here for the first time, you'll find out that I ask every speaker the same three questions. But because it's the 75th anniversary, we're going to add a fourth special question. So, but she knows. So, you ready?
I'm ready.
And I can't tell, is mic's good? Her, her mic is good. Good. Excellent. All right. So, your first question, these are hard questions. When did you first get interested in science?
Yeah, I have sort of a weird answer to that one. My dad was a scientist, and one of my early memories is he was doing research on Drosophila and fruit flies at the time, and I was maybe 5 or 6, and I really liked animals, including flies apparently, and it bothered me that he drowned the flies at the conclusion of the experiment. So I asked if I could bring them home and just, take care of them. And he said, well, okay. So, I had this terraria of fruit flies, and that didn't go well for our house, and we ended up not being able to do that. But um, it's something that I actually might, I still have that impulse. I think my Twitter feed seems to think that what I really care about most are animal rescue stories. Where they have like an animal in distress and then they show it later. And, my son's looking over my shoulder and he's like, Mom, that's not even the same pig. They brought in a different pig for the after, and it's all AI generated anyway. You've got to stop wasting your time like this. So I tell that is because there's something I think in biologists, even though none of that has to do with like science per se, a lot of biologists, most biologists, I think, have a real love of their study animals or plants. We have sort of a love of life, and I think that's actually really important.
How about now a teacher? Doesn't matter, from
Yeah.
anywhere in your life who was influential on you.
Yeah, so that actually again would be my dad, but again, not so much because of the science he was doing, but the way that he thought. So he was not a believer at all in received wisdom. He would, rather than sort of read about something or try to see what other people said about it, he would just make his own observations, just in daily life, and then reasoning. He was very into reasoning and trying to figure out how things were working. And that is the heart of science, really, that process.
So when you're not saving animals, studying bees, what's something you like to do for fun?
Well, I do a lot of yoga, actually. That is a recent interest of mine that I really enjoy. And right now, I really enjoy spending a lot of time with my kids. I'm almost an empty nester, so.
And then the last special question. So this is the 75th anniversary of the Princeton Plasma Physics Laboratory. So what was the state of your field approximately 75 years ago?
Right. So it's shocking to look at the papers in ecology from 75 years ago. So people were actually hand drawing their figures, like with a ruler and a pencil, which I actually think is good in some ways, but in any event, and the sample sizes were tiny because it was basically, one person collecting their data a lot of the time. And the study organisms where people really knew a lot or were learning a lot about, big charismatic furry things, mammals, birds. There's a fair amount of work on plants, but very little on the types of animals that I study. So,
And with that, bees in the trees, discovering the bee pollinators of the Northeastern forests, Professor Rachael Winfree. Thank
thank
you.
you so much. Thank you. Thanks so much for being here. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share my work with you all. And it's pretty fun for me to be on this side of the podium because my kids came to Science on Saturday for many years. They always looked forward to that in the winter. So this is really special for me to get to be here. So I just want to start by acknowledging the members of my research group at Rutgers. And these photos just show some of the people who contributed to the work that I'll be sharing with you today. So I study wild bees, which can sound like kind of a weird thing to be into. And furthermore, these animals can be small and pretty easy to miss. So why are wild bees important? So the answer is because bees are pollinators. And without pollinators, we actually wouldn't have most of the plants on Earth. So a brief reminder of what pollination is. So plants need to find mates, just like animals do. But plants have this problem that they're stuck in one place because they're growing in the ground. So most plant species rely on animals to actually find mates for them and move their pollen around. So pollination actually takes place when a bee that's foraging on a flower contacts the male part of the flower here that has pollen, and it gets some pollen on its body, and then it moves on to the next flower and contacts the female part of that next flower, and that is pollination. So as in this diagram, most individual plants are actually both male and female, but they still need to mate with another individual plant. So it's important to remember, though, that bees are not trying to pollinate plants. So bees are just acting in their own best interest. They're foraging on flowers because they eat pollen and nectar. So in particular, bees are collecting pollen and storing it on their bodies. And you can see all the pollen here that these bees have collected and stored. And they do that because they carry the pollen back to their nest and they give it to their offspring to eat. So the pollination is a benefit to the plant, but it really happens accidentally from the bee's point of view. So to sum up then why bees are important, pollination by animals, of which bees are probably the main pollinator group, pollination is required by almost 90% of the world's plant species and also by 75% of the leading global food crops. So just to make that last point visually, this is an image of the Whole Foods produce section as it appears today, with all the produce that is available to us with the bee pollinators. And then this is an image of the same produce section, but without pollinators. They just went through, the Whole Foods went through and removed all the fruits and vegetables that rely on animal pollination. So this would be what we have to, shop from if we didn't have pollinators. Okay, so what are wild bees? I started out saying that I work on wild bees. What are wild bees? So I use the term wild bees mainly to distinguish from a bee species that I don't study, which is the honeybee. So the honeybee is actually a non-native species. It's from Europe and North America, and it's managed in hives by people for both honey production and crop pollination. So the honeybee is a domesticated animal. It's analogous to a chicken, say. Whereas the wild bees refers to all the wild, non-domesticated bee species that are out there. So wild bees are analogous to wild birds that we would see in natural environments, like this yellow-rumped warbler here. And just like wild birds, there's a rich diversity of native wild bee species. In fact, there are over 20,000 species worldwide. Probably, that's a bit of an estimate because new species are being discovered all the time. There are probably about 4,000 bee species native to the US. And in New Jersey, there are probably about 425 species that are native here. So wild bees take all kinds of forms. They can be large and fuzzy, like this bumblebee. They can be smaller than a grain of rice, this little bee here. So some bees are black and yellow, which is familiar to most people who are familiar with the honeybee. But actually, there are many colors. Many bees are blue. And one of my favorite groups are even metallic green. So what resources do wild bees need? They need basically two things. All these wild species need two main types of resources. They need a suitable nest site where they lay their eggs. And here you see a female bee just looking out of her nest hole in the ground that she's dug for herself and her offspring. And then they also need pollen and nectar from flowers. So wild bees in all their life stages feed only on flowers. So while every wild bee species has these two fundamental needs, the way that they find and use these resources varies quite a lot across species. Bee nesting strategies, for example, about 70% of wild bees excavate nests in the soil, and so they're really nesting underground. They create these tunnels where they put the pollen ball and lay an egg, and that's just the baby bee hatching out there and feeding. But some bees use other kinds of nests, including using old mouse nests, like this bumblebee here, or using beetle holes, like this Osmia species. Some bee species actually dig, like chew their own nests, make their own nests in woods. That's a carpenter bee. And then others nest, and if you break open the stems of many kinds of shrubs and flowering plants, there's often a hollow center, and some bee species specialize on nesting in that hollow center inside the stem. Okay, so the second resource that all bees need is their food, which is flowers. And bees feed on pollen and nectar, both of which they get from foraging on flowers. And female bees in particular are collecting pollen to provision their offspring inside the nest. So female bees basically spend their whole lives foraging on flowers. And the reason they do that is how many offspring they can produce is really determined by how many of these nests they can provision with pollen. And of course, how many offspring you produce is the main thing that natural selection is working on. So evolution by natural selection makes female bees very busy at flowers. And that is, in fact, what makes them such good pollinators, because that's what they do their whole life, go from flower to flower. And plant species actually differ quite a bit in the amino acid profile and the lipid content of their pollen. Pollen is the protein source that bees use. And to a lesser extent, plants differ in the content of their nectar. So to support a lot of bee species, it's important to have a variety of flowers. And in addition, there are a minority of bee species, maybe about 20%, that actually specialize on particular flowers. So they may go to only one genus of plants, rarely to only one species of plant. So that's another reason why having a diversity of flowers like we have in natural communities is really important for bees. And in fact, the main conservation practice that's used for wild bees is basically just planting flowers. So usually this is done in meadow-type situations like this. You can see pollinator habitat project, and we're providing food sources for bees. So I'd like to use the rest of my time today to tell you about my lab's research, in particular on forest-associated bees. So I'd like to start with two mysteries. So these were strange things I noticed when I started studying wild bees in New Jersey almost 25 years ago. So the first was that there seemed to be a mismatch between the conservation actions people were taking to create habitat for bees, which again were these sort of pollinator meadows being planted, these are really just open habitats, and a mismatch between that and the dominant native vegetation type in our region, which is actually deciduous forest. And so more usually in ecology, restoring native species involves restoring the dominant native vegetation type. But that didn't seem to be what was going on. So that was surprising. So I wondered, why are we planting meadows if they aren't, in fact, the dominant native vegetation in this region? And certainly there are always some meadow-type habitats in the East, even in prior to European colonization. Native Americans maintained some open habitats, and there's some open habitats naturally. But it's very clear from the geological and pollen records that the dominant native vegetation in the East was deciduous forest for a long time. So then the second thing I wondered is, why aren't wild bees more tied to forests? And again, usually in ecology, the native vegetation type supports a lot of native species that have, co-evolved with that habitat type. But my lab was finding that wild bees as a whole actually didn't seem to be more abundant or more diverse in the native vegetation type. And that's a little bit weird. It seemed odd, particularly because forest has been the dominant land cover in Eastern North America for at least 10,000 years. And that was 10,000 years ago, the glaciers retreated and the trees recolonized. And of course, for millions of years before that, it was also forested, but it's had at least 10,000 years since the last glacial period. And furthermore, there are actually many animal-pollinated plants in deciduous forests, including many of the trees themselves. And this here is red maple, one of New Jersey's more common trees. You may have it in your yard, actually. And it'll start blooming in another 4 or 5 weeks, and it's a great bee tree. And yet what my lab was finding were things like this. So this is just one early study I did where I went and collected bees in patches of forest. So these are my study plots here in yellow. But the landscape surrounding the study plots differed greatly from being largely urban. So this is just a little patch of forest to being a patch of forest surrounded largely by other forests. So on the x-axis here, we have the proportion of forest cover measured at a 500-meter radius, a half kilometer around the plot, going from almost 0 to almost 100%. And on the y is the number of bee species that I collected in those plots. And you can see that there's no clear pattern here, and it's certainly not an increase, which is what we would expect if bees were reliant on the native vegetation. We would have gotten something like that. But here in this very deforested area, you're still getting lots of bees. So that was surprising to me to find that there were similar numbers of bees across such a steep forest loss gradient. So all of this led to a question: could some bee species maybe be associated with forests, but we just don't know it yet? So maybe there are particular bee species that are adapted to forests, and then there are other species that are more adapted to deforested open habitat types. But when we lump all the bees together, as everyone had been doing up to that point, we get a misleading picture. So this question was tackled by a PhD student in my research group, Tina Harrison, who's now Dr. Tina Harrison, and a data scientist and also a mom. So Tina did a really well-designed field study that really nailed this question about which bees use forested versus deforested landscapes. So Tina collected bees at 36 sites across 3 states, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York. And she used what's called a blocked design, where each block was a cluster of 3 sites here. And here, each of these were set in a different type of landscape. So the green was a site in a forested landscape, the yellow was a site in an agricultural landscape, and the red was a site in an urban landscape. And I'm going to zoom in on just one block here that shows 3 of these sites to explain why Tina did her study design like this. So she collected bees at the center of each of these. And you can see when I say a landscape, I mean there's a pretty big area. It's 3-kilometer diameter there. And within each of these 3-kilometer diameter landscapes, it was at least 80% forest, 80% agriculture, or 80% urban. And the reason this is such an important component of the study design to make the inferences we're trying to make about the habitats bees use is that bees are super mobile. They can easily fly, even a tiny bee can easily fly hundreds of meters just while it's foraging on flowers. So if you go to a landscape like, say, the Princeton area, and there's a little patch of forest and a little bit of suburbia, where you find a bee doesn't necessarily mean that it lives there or that it requires that habitat. It could have just been flown in there for, half an hour to forage on the flowers there. So in contrast, when Tina collects a bee in the center of this agricultural area, she's pretty confident that that bee is there because the population of that species actually does well in an agricultural landscape, because this distance is beyond what most bees in our study would be flying just to forage on flowers. So what we found here overall, and I'm going to simplify this a bit by just considering the habitat associations using the categories of either forested landscape or deforested landscape. So deforested is either urban or agricultural. I'm not sure what happened there, actually. Hopefully he can turn that down at his end. So we found that about a third of the bee species in our region are primarily found in forested habitats, so landscapes. So landscapes that look like this, 32% of species were primarily found in those kinds of landscapes. And these species were much less abundant in the deforested landscapes, generally by a factor of 10 or more. And then we found that another third of species were found primarily in the deforested open habitats, so either in agricultural or urban. And interestingly, the agricultural and urban landscapes seem similar from a bee's point of view. In other words, we found similar bee species in those two deforested habitat types. And then the last third of species were habitat generalists that were similarly common in both forested and deforested landscapes. So overall then, almost 2/3 of the northeastern US bee species use forest habitat, either exclusively or along with also using deforested habitat. So Tina also found that bees in different habitats had distinct phenology or timing. And here on the x-axis, we just have the month going from April through October. And on the y, we have the number of bee species that were found at a given site. And here the forest sites are in green, the agricultural sites are in yellow, and the urban sites are in red. So you can see that in deforested habitats, bees tend to fly in the summer. The peak is sort of late July, August. And that's actually because, and you can also see that these are really similar, the agricultural and urban. And again, that's because they actually contained a lot of the same bee species that use deforested landscapes. So it seems that bees perceive primarily a difference between the forested and deforested. So these summer flying bees that use deforested habitat types are a good mix to a good match to the way that pollinator habitat meadows are being planted, because these meadows are composed mainly of summer blooming plants that would bloom at the time that these bees are flying. And also the meadow habitats are an open type of habitat where these bees would prefer to be anyway. But we see a really different situation for forests. So bees in forests fly mainly in the spring, in April and May. And this is actually when bloom happens in the forest in April and May. We get all the forest wildflowers on the forest floor. And April and May is also when the trees bloom, creating this sort of meadow in the sky for bees. So to sum up then about the phenology and the difference between these habitats, the forest bees peak in spring, as do the flowers that bloom in forests. And the open habitat bees peak in summer, as do the flowers that bloom in open habitats. And furthermore, many of the forest bee species over here only live a few weeks as adults. So they wouldn't even encounter these summer blooming plants in open habitats, because they wouldn't even be flying as adult bees at that time. So basically what that indicated to us is that pollinator habitat restoration, the way it's currently being done, is more or less irrelevant to the bees that were probably our original native bee fauna in Eastern North America. So specifically, most forest bees have a life cycle like this, such that they are above ground and flying as adults, mainly from sort of March to May. And that's when the forest looks like this. The leaves aren't out yet, and there are a lot of flowers. So this is the above ground. But then for the rest of the year, other than these 2 months, bees are below ground, and they're in these other life forms. And that actually seems like a pretty good adaptation to forest, because by usually around June 1st, the leaves are all out and the canopy closes in this area, and it becomes very dark, and things are pretty much not flowering after that point. So again, this whole life cycle seems tied to forests. Okay, so the result of all this is that forests really support a distinct bee fauna, and it's mostly concentrated in just a few genera. And so these are a different group of species than those found in deforested habitats. And they have life history traits like flying as adults in April and May that seem very much like adaptations to the forest habitat. And most of these forest-associated species were at least 10 times more abundant in the forested as opposed to the deforested habitats. So here I'm just showing you some of the actual species. And the number in red is the factor by which that bee is more abundant in forested as compared with deforested habitats. So you can see it's up to 100 times, 300 times, or even infinity times for bee species that we collected a lot of in the forested landscape, but we collected zero, not even a single individual in the deforested landscapes. Okay, so I had previously showed you that when all bee species are considered together, the number of bee species does not increase with increasing forest cover, that this is just no relationship there. So in other words, when you look at all bee species together, there's no evidence that deforestation is a problem for bees as a whole. But when you go back to this relationship now with our increased knowledge of which bee species are actually forest associated, we can plot this again. But now it's the same x-axis, but it's a different y, that it's just the number of forest-associated bee species. So I'm plotting only the subset of species that we know from other research, from Tina's research, are associated with forest. And now we see a pretty different picture, which is that it does, they do increase quite a bit when there's more forest around. So in other words, deforestation is a problem for the forest bees. So now I'd like to just say a bit more about the main groups of forest-associated bees. So to introduce you to some of the actual animals. So this is the genus Andrena. Andrena is the most diverse bee genus in the eastern US with over 100 Andrena species just in the Northeast, and they're mostly forest-associated. They're mostly spring bees. They fly only in April and May. They're underground in a different life form for the rest of the year. And many of them are specialists on spring blooming forest plants. This is a genus Nomada. So Nomada are brood parasites of Andrena. So a brood parasite just means that the Nomada don't build their own nests. They lay their eggs in the nest of a different bee. And you can see that this female Nomada here, this is an Andrena nest, and she's getting ready to go down into the Andrena nest and lay her eggs in that nest. And like their host species, most Nomada fly just in April and May. So Osmia is another forest-associated and spring-flying genus. Many Osmia species forage on spring-blooming plants in the rose family, including apple, peach, pear, blackberry. So they're really important pollinators of fruit crops. And many Osmia species nest either in holes in trees or on the inside of plant stems. And they also have this really cute habit of carrying their pollen back to their nest on their abdomen instead of on their legs. They just carry it on their abdomen. And then lastly, Augochlora and Augochloropsis are primarily tropical genera, but we have a few species in the eastern US. And this species, Augochlora pura, one of our forest specialists, actually nests in rotting wood. So its best habitat are the really mature forests where no one is going in and clearing out all the dead wood. The dead and decaying trees are just left there. All right, so the next question we asked after sort of figuring out which bees are associated with forests is what plants do bees feed on in forests? And this work was led by Katie Turo, who until recently was a postdoc with me at Rutgers. She's now Professor Katie Turo. She's an assistant professor at Fordham University in New York. So going back to the topic of what bees are doing on flowers, so they're primarily collecting pollen from lots of different flowers and storing it on their legs here to take back and feed to their offspring. So a convenient side effect of this is that we can catch a bee and take the pollen off of it, the pollen it's carrying, and then you can identify the pollen. And that basically gives us a record, a data record of what plant species that bee was collecting pollen from. So that's what Katie did. So she first netted bees all across New Jersey. So she net collected bees either from Flowers are from their nests, and all across, these are her study sites across the 3 main forested regions of New Jersey. And then she removed the pollen from the bees and used pollen metabarcoding to identify the plant species by their DNA, so to determine which pollen the bee was carrying. So pollen metabarcoding is a newish tool that basically sequences just all the pollen, the whole sample of pollen at once, and it determines what plant species the pollens came from. And we can do that because the plant species in the East are pretty much all barcoded. The bees are not, by the way. We can't do bee ID this way, but the plants are all barcoded at this point. So it basically gives you a list of plant species that the bee had foraged on, over that morning or whatever, and collected pollen from. So it's a really powerful technique. So using this molecular approach, Katie determined which forage plants were most used by forest bees, and these are the top 10 plants in New Jersey forests shown here, and that just has the percentage of all pollen on bees that came from those plants. And these are the native plant species that bees are using in forests, and interestingly, these are all trees or woody shrubs. So some of these may be familiar to you. This is blueberry, another species of blueberry. This is blackberry. And these are trees: red maple, sugar maple, black cherry. So these are the native plants that bees are feeding on in forests. But then we also found that non-native plants were frequently used by forest bees. For example, dandelion is actually a really good bee plant and shows up in forests sometimes. So this use of the non-native plants is interesting, but it's really not unexpected because most species of bees are generalists. They'll forage on any plant that provides good pollen and nectar. They don't particularly care what country it came from. So Katie noticed something interesting in these data, which is that the forest specialist bees, so here these are all forest specialist bee species here, these forest specialists were using a lot of pollen from trees and from woody shrubs. So the woody plants, the trees and shrubs are in brown here. And you can see these forest specialists, this is proportion of pollen that they were carrying. And it's pretty dominated by the woody plants. And then interestingly, the habitat generalist bees, which of course there were some of those in forests because that's their gig. They use both forested and deforested habitats. They're using more the plants that grow on the ground level, the grasses and herbs. So this suggests, again, that the forest-associated bees are actually adapted to forests and that they're really using the trees, they're using the vertical habitat. Okay, so this is the last project I'd like to tell you about, and this work is being done by Joanna Greenwood, who is currently a PhD student in my lab and also a very good tree climber. So Joanna's project started with the observation that mature forests, like this one I'm showing you here, are often hundreds of years old, and these kinds of forests, these truly mature forests, are hard to find in eastern North America. So over 99% of forest area in the East was logged or cleared for agriculture at some point during the last 2 centuries. So the forests that forest bees live in now, and the forests we have now, are really what ecologists call second growth forests, meaning they're a mix of regenerating trees of different ages. And also much of the forest in the East is currently managed for timber harvest to some degree, which typically means that trees are harvested when they're maybe 80 or 100 years old. That's sort of the price point for when you harvest trees. But compared to the lifetimes of these trees, that's actually pretty young. So a lot of our native forest trees would be living 300-400 years, even up to 600 or 700 years for long-lived trees like hemlock. So Joanna's research question then is, how do bee communities change over time after a timber harvest? So in other words, she's asking about the big picture. She's asking how well forest bees might persist in the kinds of forests we have now, which actually much of the time are in some stage of regeneration. As shown by this diagram here, that takes 100+ years for a forest to kind of get back to being what we think of as a forest after it was harvested. So to study this question, Joanna went to Connecticut to an experimental forest that's managed by Yale University, which has the longest forestry chronoseries experiment in the eastern US. So a chronoseries just means a long-term experiment that has plots where the experimental treatment, which in this case is timber harvest, was done in different years. So at the Yale Myers Forest in Connecticut, every year since 1992, 1 6 to 8 hectare area has been harvested. So the chronoseries of all these forests of different ages post-harvest that consists of forests between 1 and 32 years old right now. And then Joanna also added some plots here. This is just showing her sites in the Yale Myers Forest of mature forest or unharvested forests that were probably, we don't know exactly how old they were, probably 120, 150 years old. So this is just to show you what forests look like when they are 3 years post-harvest, 10 years post-harvest, and 30 years post-harvest, and then also a mature forest control. And the flowers available to bees also change a lot over this time period, going from mostly flowers at the ground level in the newly harvested plot, because it's sort of colonized by early successional plants, up to mostly flowers up in the canopy, like this red maple flower. By the time that the forest is 30 or so years old, the trees are big enough to be flowering and reproducing. So Joanna collected bees by multiple methods to sample bees all the way from the ground level as well as up in the forest canopy, because she really wanted to know where the bees were, what resources they were using, and what species are actually using the plots. So traps were set on the forest floor here, and then also we used a 7-foot slingshot to shoot ropes up into the canopy, and Joanna made traps that she could put on these ropes and pull up into the canopy so that she could actually catch the bees that are foraging up in the tops of the trees. So here I'm going to show you her results. So on the x-axis of each of these plots, we have the age of the trees in the plot, basically the years post-harvest, going from 0 for ones that were just logged last year up to 32. And then there's an axis break here, and then unharvested, the more mature forests. And on the y-axis is just the abundance of bees, so the number of individual bees that Joanna got in forests of that age. And then she divided this into 3 types of bees, the same 3 types we've been talking about: the forest-associated bees, the habitat generalists, and the open habitat bees that are more, sort of specialists on deforested habitat. So let's look at the forest bee results first. So we found a U-shaped curve suggesting that bees, actually the forest bees, like the newly logged plots. They don't seem to like the plots that are full of a lot of small trees, a lot of the small saplings before the trees are reproductive. But then once the trees start reproducing and flowering and are bigger, they seem to like those again. And then the unharvested one is really a mix. It contains both it was an unharvested site that had the greatest abundance of forest bees in the whole study, but then there are also a bunch of unharvested sites that didn't have many bees. So this was not what we expected. So these species, these forest bees, were defined as forest bees because they're much more abundant in forested as compared with deforested landscapes. Yet now when people come in and deforest a plot, the bees like that. In fact, they actually seem to prefer it to some of the mature unharvested plots. So what's up with that? That was pretty confusing. Moving on to the habitat generalists, Joanna found many fewer of the generalists overall, and that's not surprising because we're in an extensively forested area. And the habitat generalists were mainly in the recently logged plots. They didn't really stick around as the forest started regenerating. And lastly, the open habitat bees mainly showed up again in the very recently harvested, the newly logged sites, and they're pretty much absent from all forests that are 10 or more years old. So you'll notice too that the points, the height of the points on the y-axis are super different here. We had way more, up to 500, 600 forest bees in just, one sample here. And we didn't catch as many habitat generalists and even fewer open habitat bees, which totally makes sense because we were working in this extensively forested area in Connecticut. And also we collected our data in the spring in April and May, which is exactly when the forest bees are flying and those other bees aren't flying. Not all of them are flying. And we did that on purpose because we're interested primarily in the forest bees. So to summarize these results, and bees' response to forest regeneration after timber harvest do depend on their habitat association of the bee, so that we had expected. But contrary to our starting expectation, the forest bees are abundant in both younger and older forests. So how do we make sense of this finding that forest bees are abundant in newly logged sites? So we were surprised by it at first, but when we sort of think about it more deliberately in terms of bee ecology and also the way that we determined the habitat associations in the first place, it actually makes quite a bit of sense. So the first thing to realize is that the timber harvests at the Yale Mouse Forest are mostly smaller than 10 hectares. And these relatively small harvested areas are embedded within a broadly forested landscape. So just as an example, this blue outline is actually a timber harvest that you can see on Google Earth. It was done at the Yale Mouse Forest. That was their 2023 harvest. And it covers about 5 hectares. And you can see that it's surrounded by a lot of other forests. And actually this scale of timber harvest of sort of 5 to 10, usually not more than 15 hectares, is pretty typical for New England. In Maine and in the southern US, they do much, much bigger clear cutting than that. But in New England, largely for just sort of cultural reasons, the public are not comfortable with big clear cuts, and so they're mostly these smaller cuts. So you'll recall that the study that classified bees as either forest or deforested associated did that based on the land cover at a 1.5 kilometer radius. So that's a really big scale. So we know from that research that the forest-associated bees won't persist in a landscape that has little or no forest. But these timber harvests are on a much smaller scale, and I overlaid here, this is the 1.5 kilometer radius. So this is a scale at which forest bees are, we know that they respond to forest cover at that scale. And here's the timber harvest within that. And these timber harvests are actually smaller than the typical bee foraging range. So an individual bee could easily be living here and could fly in to forage in that newly cut area to feed on the flowers there. And that would totally make sense because when there is a new timber cut and a deforested area, there often are a lot of flowers because there's suddenly a lot more light, and some of the early successional plants flower a lot. So our conclusion then is that the forest-associated bees need forests to persist, but they'll also use these small-scale logging openings if they're there. So what we expect then, and I'm framing this slide as expect, not know, because we haven't actually done any field studies on this. What we expect is that the effects of timber harvest on forest bees depend on landscape context. So we expect forest loss in a deforested landscape, which we haven't studied yet, but we would expect that to reduce forest bees. So if we were starting in a landscape like this, it just had a few patches of forest. If there are forest bees there to begin with, they would probably be harmed by removing those few patches. All right, so I would like to conclude by just drawing some conclusions from this work for the practice of bee conservation and how we could make bee conservation more efficient and effective. So the first conclusion is that we need new conservation actions for forest bees. So in other words, the conservation actions we take need to be different for the bees that are adapted to forests versus those that are adapted to deforested habitats. So the summer blooming flowering meadows that are currently the main pollinator conservation action are actually irrelevant to forest bees because they're at the wrong time of year and they're in the wrong habitat. The forest bees aren't even flying as adults anymore by the time these summer flowering meadows bloom. So instead, what forest bees need are spring blooming wildflowers and trees like maples and cherries that grow in the deciduous forest. And we also found that timber harvests are compatible with forest bees. So timber harvests on the scale that's generally done in New England seem to work fine for forest bees, provided that the landscape itself at a larger scale is still mostly forested. So that's really good news for forest bees because the timber harvests are going to continue regardless. So it's great that the forest bees are okay with that. And then there's something that we haven't explicitly studied in my research group, but which we noticed in doing this work, which is that many forests in our region are missing their native wildflowers and shrubs. So the ground level plants that sort of should be here are actually not here. And instead, we just get ferns or some invasive plants that are species that deer don't like to eat. And this is probably because we have white-tailed deer. In fact, we have quite a lot of white-tailed deer. So really clear guidance for bee conservation is that actually deer control could regenerate our understory plants. And that is a big part of what bees eat in forests. Okay, so my last slide here is just some take-homes. This is not so much about my research as it is just what you can do for wild bees in your own backyard. So I want to close with this because one of the really inspiring things about working on bees is that even really small spaces, I mean, bees are small animals. Small yards and gardens can be excellent bee habitat. I've found 30 or more native bee species in single backyards and, not even fancy gardens, just like backyards in New Jersey. And, and also many of the actions that we can take to encourage bee populations, support bee populations just around the places we live actually involve not doing things rather than doing a whole bunch of fancy things. So that's always good news for busy people. So first and probably most important, I haven't really focused on in this talk because it's not what I work on for research, but avoiding insecticides. So unsurprisingly, bees are insects. Insecticides are designed to kill insects. They kill bees really effectively. Bees are super sensitive to insecticides. And just avoiding insecticides goes a really long way towards providing places where bees can live. Insecticides are probably one of the main causes of bee decline at global scales. And you have to really try to avoid insecticides because it's in a lot of products. If you just go to Home Depot and buy grass seed or fertilizer, read the label carefully because a lot of them have insecticides in there. A second thing you can do is let some weeds grow in your grass, assuming that you have some areas that are in grass. So grass is useless to bees because it doesn't have the kind of flowers that they feed on. But many of the weeds that will just naturally colonize your yard are actually great bee plants. So dandelion and white clover are two of the better bee plants out there. And those are the plants, they will show up. Like you don't have to do anything. They will show up if you don't, use weed killer on them, basically. And so you can really have quite good bee habitat even just, in a somewhat more natural yard. Um, and third, leave some dead wood around for nesting because that will bring in all the bee species that nest in wood or just even in stems of shrubs and, leave, like don't clear out your garden plants in the winter. Um, and then the fourth, this is an active thing, obviously, but if you're a gardener and you're going to plant flowers, plant native plants that bloom at different times a year because the bees all have these different phenologies. They'll be active at different times a year, so you want something blooming. And that's a total easy fit to gardeners, right? Because we like that anyway. We always try to have something blooming at different times a year, and I actually think that's often why backyard suburban gardens, even urban gardens, are fantastic bee habitat because gardeners and bees sort of have this same goal in that regard. And I'm saying native plants here. I just showed you data that bees use non-native plants, and that's totally true. I'm saying native plants not to distinguish from non-native ones, which can be fine for bees, but to distinguish from the other kinds of plants that you might buy in a garden center, because nurseries and garden centers sell a lot of plants that are actually often don't even make pollen or nectar. They're bred or created not to, and so therefore they don't feed bees. And that's for a mix of reasons. Some people don't, for cut flowers, don't like pollen because it's like messy and gets all over. So they make flowers that don't make pollen. And some of them are like, marketed products, the plant, right? So they don't want it to reproduce because then you don't have to buy more. They want you buying more every year, whereas the native plants obviously can reproduce, and so they have pollen and nectar. So that's why I say native plants there. There's some garden plants that are not real plants from a bee's point of view. And then the last thing I want to just highly recommend to all of you is if you want to identify wild bees in your yard or anywhere else, download the app iNaturalist. This is a really good app. It's free, and it does an extremely good job of identifying, all species basically, but it's also really good for bees. So it's a combination. You basically take a photo of something you've seen, upload it to the app, and it uses AI to identify the bees, and the AI bee identification is getting really good. I mean, it's scarily good. But then iNat also has this really cool feature that you can make your photo accessible to the research community, and other people who use iNat, which includes a lot of bee researchers, can then, write in and say, I think it's this, so they can correct the AI if it's wrong, or they can get it to a higher level. And there's a really nice community of bee people who use iNat and do those IDs, including a grad student in my lab, Max McCarthy. You may have noticed his photo credit on a lot of the photos in this talk. He does a lot of the BID on iNat for the Eastern US, actually, just like in his free time, and he's really, really good. So that is a super fun thing to get into. Okay, so I'm going to thank my funding sources. So my work's been funded primarily throughout my career by NSF, the National Science Foundation, and thank very much Rutgers University for supporting me in my lab, and the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, which is the largest bee conservation, pollinator conservation organization in the world, which I work with a lot. So thank you so much for being here. You're welcome. Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much for just a wonderful lecture. We're going to have microphones coming around. So if you'd like to ask a question of our speaker, please raise your hand. And then I will also take a look at the Zoom. If you have a question, if you could put it into the chat. And 1 second as some people are headed out, and then microphones will come around.
Up there, yes.
Perfect. Okay, there you go. Right, see right there. Right there.
Sure. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for that really interesting lecture.
Thank you.
One of the biggest environmental tragedies in the East Coast happened in the early 20th century, which was the collapse of the chestnut forest.
Yeah.
When that happened, or when those kinds of things happened, I mean, the pollen was enormous from those trees. Did that affect the bee populations? I mean, do you know? I mean, even.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's super interesting question because there is actually a bee that's a specialist on chestnut. And it is still around. People had assumed it had gone extinct and no one saw it for a while, but it was rediscovered in one of the places, one of the experimental places where plant breeders are trying to sort of bring back chestnut and maybe crossbreed it with a European species or an Asian species more resistant to chestnut blight. And that bee is still living there, so it didn't go extinct. So that was certainly, I mean, no one was measuring, monitoring wild bee populations back then at all. So we don't really know, but I mean, that species must have crashed at that time. And probably, I'm sure it harmed other species as well because enormous pollen resource. I mean, chestnut was, the dominant tree in eastern forests, really, and now it's gone. So yeah, tree disease is a huge, huge issue for forests.
In the back row, over there to your right.
What evolutionary and population differences do you expect to see in urban bees versus forest bees?
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting question because one of the things that I wondered about when we started finding, like how can bees be specialized on urban and agricultural habitats? Like these habitats have only been here for 200 years, right? So what that probably means is that evolutionarily, the bees that we now find in these very human disturbed habitats, they probably evolved to be in other kinds of open habitats. There's no way that they evolved for urban or agricultural habitats specifically, but they probably were in naturally occurring open areas like places, disturbance from storms, from rivers that overflow their banks and kill a lot of the trees, from insect outbreaks. They were probably a minority of the bee species in the East in pre-European times. But now they've had this bonanza of open habitats when, people came over and deforested a lot of the East.
You talked about how bees need a place to and a source of food. And you talked about how the food is plentiful in the spring and the summer. And I was wondering about what do they do in the winter? You said they are underground in the winter, but do they have to be busy storing extra food like bears do?
Right. No, that's a great question. And there's a big component of bees that I omitted from this talk just for reasons of time, which is that some bees are social. So they live in these huge hives like honeybees. And, most people are familiar with that. And they think all bees are like that. There can be 30,000 honeybees in one hive. And they do remain, the adults live over the winter. And so they need to store food for the winter. That's what honey is, actually. It's their stored food. But 95% of bee species are not social like that. They're just one individual bee making her nest. And those adult bees do not live over the winter. They die with the first frost or, earlier, depending on their life cycle. And so the form that overwinters is just the egg or the pupa. It's an immature form, underground in the nest. And then it emerges as an adult the following year. So those they generally aren't feeding over the winter. They're, in their, it's not hibernation, but, something like that.
How long do the social bees live?
The individual bees in the summer, only a few weeks. They actually get physically worn out. Like that's how hard bees work. In the winter, the honeybees have a sort of longer live, like beekeepers call it the winter bee, and the individuals survive the whole winter often.
But do they survive more than 1 year?
No.
Short time living.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We have a question online. How important are the flowers of the tulip poplar for the forest bees?
Oh, yeah, that's so interesting because they're such conspicuous flowers to us. We do not find bees carrying a lot of tulip poplar pollen. And that's sort of all I can say. I mean, we're the only lab that is sequencing this. Well, there's one of the labs starting to do it, but we haven't seen a lot of it, like occasionally, but it's not one of their main gigs.
Playing off that same issue, the species mix in the eastern deciduous forest has, for a very long period of time, been primarily maple, beech, oak association with large components. Obviously, the loss of a large component being the loss of the chestnut. We're now in the middle of the loss of the ash.
Right.
Is that a research opportunity, and what's the implication for bee conservation?
Yeah, so ash isn't a big bee tree. Ash is wind pollinated. So I don't expect to see big impacts on bees. Obviously, there are going to be huge impacts on a lot of other things. But interestingly, bees, one of the surprises in looking at the pollen bees are actually feeding on in forests is they actually do eat pollen of wind pollinated trees, which seems odd, but only of particular groups. They seem to eat a fair amount of oak pollen, but not ash for some reason. Yeah.
As the species mix, playing off that, obviously a much larger component of the eastern forest these days is the invasives, particularly Ailanthus.
Yeah.
Are you seeing some implications on species mix as a result?
No, we haven't really seen Ailanthus pollen. I mean, I think of that as more of sort of a forest edge species. The main pollens that we're seeing are maple is far and away the biggest one. And maple is actually, people thought it was wind pollinated for a long time, and it may be in part, but it's definitely partly animal pollinated as well. It's a pretty interesting genus in that regard. It's unusual that plants would be both those things, but maple is the core thing, and then also the trees in the rose family, like cherries and yeah.
Thanks.
To your right in the front.
Hi, thank you. This is anecdotal, but it seems to me that I can sit on my deck without being bothered by gnats and flies because there's a constant breeze, if not wind.
Yep.
Is that a factor in all of this? Yeah.
Bees are much stronger flyers than mosquitoes and gnats and like the things we don't like. Bees are very strong flyers, actually, but wind is an issue for them for sure. I mean, it gets windy enough, they just like grab onto whatever plant they're on and wait it out, basically. But some of the larger bees in particular are remarkably strong. Like bumblebees, I see them flying in wind that's like way too windy for me. So, yeah.
Two questions, if I may. Is climate change impacting the bee population? And secondly, with the cutback of science funding, is that impacting your research and that of your colleagues?
Yeah, so climate change, I'm sure it's impacting bees. I mean, certainly there are good data showing bees are emerging earlier, like everything's getting earlier in the spring, right? So it's not surprising that bees are getting earlier also. Whether it's reducing their populations, I mean, if climate change continues on the trajectory it's on, yeah, it's going to be, pretty catastrophic for a lot of species. But there aren't actually strong data showing that has happened already. In my opinion, the data are not convincing, and that's mainly because we don't have good data. It's not because it isn't going on. There's actually no long-term monitoring program in North America at all for wild bees as a group, that's monitoring all species and tracking how they're doing over time. There's no such monitoring. People have been trying to put a program together, but it hasn't really happened yet. So we wouldn't really know is a short answer. For the current funding situation, it's awful for a lot of scientists. I mean, particularly, I'm the director of our graduate program in ecology and evolution at Rutgers right now, and it's really tough for grad students because they're often funded by external grants, some of which have been canceled. And that is actually my biggest concern. I mean, hopefully we have, you know, another 3 years max of this situation, but it's really damaging the younger people because, you know, people will leave science or not complete their degrees. And, you know, that to me is the worst part of it. I mean, researchers can pause our research for a few years, and that is unfortunate, but, you know, it's the graduate students that I'm most concerned about on that. And yeah, that's real. We've been pretty good at finding other ways to support them at Rutgers. Our deans are actually being great about channeling money to grad student support for people who've lost their funding support, but it's really difficult. Yes.
Two questions. First, from pollination, from the bee's perspective, would we say it's just an accident?
Yep, right.
And the second, if that's the case, from what perspective we can say that it's a purposive act?
That it's a what act? I'm sorry.
It's a act with a purpose.
Purpose. Well, the bees have a purpose, which is to eat and feed their offspring. So it's definitely purposeful, but the pollination is not purposeful on the part of the bee. I'm quite
but
sure.
From whose viewpoint
Well,
that it's a
fine
purpose?
at the moment. I mean, from the viewpoint of evolution by natural selection, like that is the way that natural selection works. So adopting that viewpoint, the bees do not have an intent to pollinate, nor is it some kind of unrecognized long-term purpose that they have either.
I seem to remember reading about die-off of bees, and maybe that was honeybees, but
Yep.
if that's true, is it affecting the wild bee population?
That's usually the first question I get. So yeah, honeybees, colony collapse disorder has been a big thing, and other health problems of honeybees. Fortunately, those seem pretty unique to honeybees, which is super fortunate. Native bee researchers were really worried about that for a while. But those seem mostly, the die-offs of honeybees seem mostly related to management of honeybees. You know, it'd be like if cows had, I mean, I don't know, hoof and mouth disease or something, and they were dying in dairy farms. You know, it doesn't necessarily mean that the wild deer have a problem with that, right? So they mostly seem management problems for honeybees and diseases that they have because they're kept at such high densities. In terms of whether the wild bees are actually declining, some are. We have good data that some species are, but some species are doing fine. And most species, we lack the data, again, because there isn't really long-term monitoring for bees.
Last question.
Yeah.
Hold on for a sec. Yeah.
Do bee mimics show the same sort of pattern?
Pattern like morphologically?
Well, no, in terms of status and distribution and abundance.
Oh, right. Yeah, I don't know. There aren't good data on bee distributions even. Like we don't have, you know, for birds or plants or mammals, you can just like Google or open a guidebook and here's the range map for that species, right? We don't have range maps for bees. We do for some bumblebees, but not for the rest, really. Like people are just developing those now. So in terms of whether the mimics stay within the same range as the thing they're mimicking, I mean, they kind of should, but we don't really have the range map info to know if that's the case. There's some really good bee mimics out there. Yeah, for sure.
And with that, if we could thank Professor Winfree one more time for just a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.